Usually when you're trying to diagnose like a physical ailment, there's a certain comfort in the precision of the tools you use.
Right, like it's very clear cut.
Exactly. I mean, you fracture your arm, you go in, the x-ray reveals this stark, jagged white line across the radius, and the physician just points to it. The pathology is entirely visible.
Yeah, the treatment protocol is binary at that point. The bone is broken, so you set the bone. It's that mechanism of cause and effect in the physical sciences that offers this really reassuring clarity. We inherently want our problems to be neatly categorized and just visually undeniable.
We really do.
Yeah.
But the moment you step out of the clinic and into the realm of, well, intellectual history, that whole diagnostic machinery just completely fails.
It falls apart.
It totally falls apart. You look at the political and cultural landscape of a nation, and you're trying to identify the source of a systemic fracture, and the images are just opaque. Like a philosophical movement intended as a cure, a theory designed specifically to liberate marginalized people, can actually, under the intense pressures of history and politics, slowly metabolize into the exact opposite.
Yeah, it becomes the intellectual scaffolding for a restrictive authoritarian revival, which is, it's the ultimate diagnostic paradox in political theory.
Right.
We're dealing with the mutation of ideas over decades. An academic framework constructed with the absolute purest emancipatory intentions can be stripped of its original context, repurposed, and then deployed to dismantle the very democratic institutions its creators thought they were protecting.
And tracing that specific, highly uncomfortable mutation is our mission for today. We are going to deconstruct the surprising and frankly shocking intellectual pipeline between postcolonial theory, which is a left-wing academic movement aimed at dismantling the legacy of Western imperialism, and the rise of Hindu nationalism, which is a powerful conservative political force in modern India.
It's a fascinating connection.
It really is. And for you, the listener, this is an exploration of how ideas designed to critique power can inadvertently become like the most effective weapons for consolidating it.
And our map for navigating this really complex terrain today is a thorough analysis of Meera Nanda's 2025 book, Postcolonial Theory and the Making of Hindu Nationalism, The Wages of Unreason. It's a text that just demands a rigorous re-examination of the real-world policy consequences born from high-level, abstract academic theory.
But before we begin unpacking the historical timeline, I really need to establish a firm boundary regarding our approach to the source material today, because Nanda's book navigates heavily charged political waters.
Very charged.
Yeah, it offers severe critiques of both the intellectual left and the political right in India. So let me be clear, we are not taking any sides today. Our only job is to be your guides through the source material, impartially unpacking Nanda's arguments and the ideas contained within them, so you can understand this fascinating intellectual debate without us endorsing any specific political viewpoint. We are strictly reading the historical X-rays.
Exactly. The goal is to observe the genealogy of these concepts. We are mapping how a specific critique of secularism in the 1980s provided the rhetorical architecture for a nationalist resurgence in the 21st century, relying entirely on the synthesis of history presented in the text.
Right. So a crucial starting point here is understanding the author's vantage point. Meera Nanda, she operates as an internal critic of the Indian intellectual tradition.
Yeah, she belongs to the generation often referred to as Midnight's children, those born in the early years of the newly independent Indian Republic.
But her academic trajectory is highly unusual, right? She didn't start in the humanities.
No, not at all. She initially trained in biotechnology. So she is a scientist by background who later transitioned into the philosophy and sociology of science. And that background in the hard sciences heavily informs her central thesis.
How so?
Well, she views her scientific training not as some tool of Western assimilation, but as an active mechanism of personal liberation. She frequently describes the traditional pre-modern worldview she grew up around as God-drenched and just constrained by rigid social hierarchies.
Right, like caste and gender role.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For her, the tools of secular scientific rationalism were quite literally the ladder she used to climb out of those traditional constraints.
Which introduces the central friction of her book. Because Nanda's core argument is that the post-colonial left in India, the intellectual vanguard that was, trying to shake off the psychological residue of British colonial rule, made a fatal strategic error.
A massive one.
Yeah, by attacking secular modernity, objective truth, and scientific rationality as inherently oppressive Western impositions, They inadvertently did the ideological spadework for the Hindu right.
Basically, they demolished the intellectual firewalls of objective truth, leaving this huge vacuum that a highly organized nationalist movement eagerly filled.
And the nuance here is super critical for you listening. Nanda is not suggesting that left-wing academics directly orchestrated or, purposely caused Hindu nationalism.
Oh, no, not at all. The Indian right possesses its own deep, autonomous, century-old historical roots. Her argument is structural. She posits that by delegitimizing the universal applicability of human rights and scientific reason, the left neutralized the only conceptual frameworks capable of holding traditional hierarchical power structures accountable.
Okay, so to understand the environment that actually allowed this intellectual shift to occur, Nanda insists we have to step away from the Indian subcontinent entirely for a minute.
We do. We have to rewind the clock.
Right, we have to look at the Weimar Republic in 1920s Germany, which is, that's a massive historical leap. Why is the political atmosphere of interwar Berlin the necessary lens for understanding post-independence India?
So we have to examine a phenomenon that historians of the Weimar period call the conservative revolution. In the aftermath of World War I, the German intellectual landscape was dominated not just by traditional reactionaries, people who merely wanted to restore the king, but by figures like Oswald Spengler, who wrote The Decline of the West, and the philosopher Martin Heidegger.
Right.
And the historian Jeffrey Herf coined a brilliant term for these thinkers. He called them reactionary modernists.
Reactionary modernism. That is a fascinating oxymoron. It suggests a desire to simultaneously move forward and backward at the same time.
Yes.
If we think about this in the context of everyday technology, it's akin to wanting the absolute newest, cutting-edge hardware, the fastest smartphone, the most advanced engineering, but insisting that this hardware only run ancient tribal software.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The reactionary modernists of the Weimar era enthusiastically embraced the hardware of the modern age industrial capacity, advanced engineering, mass communication, modern weaponry. They understood that national survival depended on technological supremacy.
But they hated the ideas behind it.
Exactly. They vehemently rejected the software of the Enlightenment. They completely despised secular rationalism, the concept of universal individual rights, and parliamentary democracy. They viewed all of that as a sterile, soulless importation from Britain and France.
So they wanted the raw power of the Industrial Revolution, but they wanted it fueled by romanticism. They wanted the factories and the infrastructure to serve the mystical concept of the Volk, the organic spiritual soul of the nation, rooted deeply in blood and soil.
Right, because they believed that liberal democracy fractured the organic unity of society. And Nanda draws very specific structural parallels between the societal conditions of Weimar Germany and those of the young Indian Republic. The similarities go way, way beyond surface-level politics.
Let's trace those structural parallels. Because intuitively, for anyone listening, the cultural landscapes of 1920s Germany and 1970s India feel worlds apart.
Sure. So the first major parallel is the foundation of the state itself. Both nations were young, fragile democracies grafted onto societies that lacked a deep internal historical tradition of liberal democratic norms.
Oh, okay.
The Weimar Constitution and the Indian Constitution were both brilliant documents on paper, but they were superimposing a liberal legal framework over populations still deeply entrenched in traditional, often feudal social relations.
That makes sense. And the second parallel is the shared psychological trauma of national humiliation. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Because the Weimar Republic was born in the shadow of the Treaty of Versailles in 1918, this devastating military defeat and economic subjugation. And India, similarly, had endured 2 centuries of extractive, brutal British colonial administration. So both populations harbored this profound, justified sense of cultural injury and a deep desire to reassert their civilizational dignity on the global stage.
Exactly. And the third and perhaps most volatile factor is the pace of economic change. Both nations experienced aggressive, incredibly rapid, but profoundly uneven industrialization. The philosopher Ernst Bloch analyzed this phenomenon in Germany using this really interesting concept called non-synchronous contradictions.
Okay, we need to unpack non-synchronous contradictions because this concept is crucial. It basically describes what happens when history stops moving in a straight line, right?
Yes.
It describes a society where radically different eras of human development are forced to coexist in the exact same physical space and time. So you have a cutting-edge aerospace engineering facility operating right next to an agricultural community functioning on medieval economic hierarchies.
Right, you literally have nuclear physicists living alongside populations whose entire life world is governed by pre-modern magical interpretations of reality. And Bloch observed that this kind of violent temporal friction creates immense psychological distress.
I can imagine.
The sheer whiplash of modernity disintegrates traditional community bonds without immediately replacing them with stable modern institutions. In this environment of chaotic transition, people become highly susceptible to backward-facing utopias.
Because the chaotic present becomes intolerable. So the culture begins to romantically mythologize a pure, untainted past, a past that, historically speaking, likely never even existed.
Exactly. They respond to the dislocation of rapid industrialization by attacking the philosophical foundations of modernity itself, treating it as an alien infection that has to be purged to restore national health.
Okay, so applying this framework to India, we have to identify the catalyst. Because Germany's reactionary modernism was catalyzed by the trauma of World War I. According to Nanda, what was India's Weimar moment? What was the crisis that shattered their faith in the modern state?
According to Nanda, that moment was the emergency of 1975 to 1977.
Right, the emergency. For context for you listening, the mid-1970s marked the collapse of the initial post-independence optimism in India. The developmental state, modeled by Jawaharlal Nehru, was failing to deliver on its promises. India was facing severe inflation, food shortages, and massive nationwide labor strikes.
It was a very turbulent time.
And in response, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi invoked constitutional provisions to declare a state of emergency. She suspended civil liberties, delayed elections, censored the press, and imprisoned political opposition. For the generation of intellectuals who had placed their absolute faith in the secular, democratic state as the ultimate engine of progress, this was a devastating betrayal.
The state itself had become the primary source of terror. So in the aftermath of the emergency, intellectuals were forced to conduct a rigorous autopsy of the Indian Republic. A highly influential cohort of thinkers, largely centered around the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, or CSDS in Delhi, began to formulate a response.
And their diagnosis of the emergency is where the timeline really diverges from standard liberal political theory, doesn't it?
It really does. They did not look at the abuses of the emergency and conclude that, well, India needed stronger constitutional guardrails or an independent judiciary or better mechanisms for holding the executive branch accountable.
Instead, figures like Ashish Nandi led this profound intellectual pivot. They began to argue that the abuses of the Indian state were not a failure to fully implement democracy, but were instead the inevitable logical outcome of attempting to impose a Western modernist apparatus onto an Indian civilization.
Right. They repackaged anti-modern romanticism as a radical emancipatory posture. For them, modernity itself was the disease.
Now, I need to pause here and address a massive caveat on behalf of the listener, because by explicitly linking these left-wing Indian academics to the conservative revolutionaries of the Weimar Republic, Nanda is bordering on highly inflammatory territory.
Oh, absolutely.
The Weimar thinkers laid the intellectual groundwork that was ultimately co-opted by the Nazis. So is Nanda implicitly labeling post-colonial theorists as fascists? I mean, wait, is she actually calling them fascists?
No. She anticipates that exact criticism and explicitly disavows it. Nanda goes out of her way to establish that the Indian postcolonial intellectuals are, by and large, committed Democrats and pacifists. Their intellectual lineage traces back to Marxism and subaltern studies, not to the aristocratic, militaristic conservatism of 1920s Germany.
Okay.
And most importantly, the Indian intellectuals completely lack the virulent racialism, anti-Semitism, and expansionist aggression that characterized the Weimar movement.
Right, so that distinction separates an intellectual critique from a totalitarian ideology. But if they lack the racial animus and the militarism, what exactly is the connective tissue that justifies the Weimar comparison in the first place?
The connective tissue is the architecture of their epistemology. It's their totalizing critique of modernity. It is the intellectual leap from acknowledging that colonial powers utilize science and modern administration as tools of extraction, which is true, to making the absolute claim that scientific rationality and liberal individualism are inherently violent concepts designed to annihilate authentic indigenous cultures.
Oh, I see. They threw out the concept of universal objective truth simply because it had arrived on colonial ships.
Exactly. It's the complete rejection of the Enlightenment software.
Okay, so having established the historical trauma that triggered this anti-modern sentiment, we need to examine the specific arguments constructed by the post-colonial left. How did they actually dismantle the legitimacy of objective truth in the academic sphere?
The foundational text for this shift was Ashish Nandy's 1983 book, The Intimate Enemy. Nandy revolutionized how Indian academia understood the colonial experience. Prior to this, the critique of British rule was largely material, focusing on the destruction of local industries, the drain of wealth, political subjugation.
Simple stuff.
Yeah. But Nandy argued that the true, enduring horror of colonialism was not material, but psychological. He defined colonialism as a psychopathology, a process of mental colonialism.
Mental colonialism. Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy for the listener. Because it's like saying the real damage of a robbery wasn't losing your money, but the fact that you now think about locks and property exactly the same way the robber does.
That's a great way to frame it. He was arguing that the most devastating conquest was the conquest of the Indian imagination. The colonial power didn't just extract resources, it dictated the very terms of reality.
It forced the colonized population to internalize Western standards of rationality, historical progress, and cultural value.
Exactly. Leading the colonized to view their own traditions as backward and inferior. And Nanda concedes that Nandy's anxieties about the homogenizing, often destructive force of technocratic development are entirely valid. The imposition of Western developmental models often ignores local ecological and social realities.
However, Nanda identifies a catastrophic blind spot in treating colonialism primarily as a psychological infection. If you redefine the primary struggle as a battle for mental decolonization, you inherently deprioritize the struggle against material, physical inequality.
Right.
If the real battleground is the mind, you stop focusing your energy on dismantling the actual physical structures of poverty, land inequality, and labor exploitation.
Nanda argues that this intense inward focus provides a carte blanche to the traditional social order. Nandy's proposed antidote to Western rationality was an idealized, romanticized vision of a non-modern, folk Hindu India.
But Nanda, leaning on her empirical background, points out that this pristine, egalitarian, non-modern India is a complete academic fabrication, doesn't she?
She absolutely does. By obsessing over cultural authenticity and mental decolonization, the postcolonial theorists effectively ignored the brutal, systemic material oppression that was hardwired into traditional Indian society centuries before the British East India Company was even formed.
And this culturalist focus birthed one of the most controversial concepts of the era: the categorization of modern science as epistemic violence.
Epistemic violence.
Yeah, it is a phrase that implies an act of physical destruction carried out through the medium of knowledge.
This concept was championed by the alternative science movement, featuring intellectuals like Nandy, Vandana Shiva, and Claude Alvarez. Their argument went far beyond the standard ethical critiques of science. They didn't just warn that scientific discoveries could be misused by imperial powers, a point universally accepted after the atomic bomb.
Right.
They made the radical ontological claim that modern science itself, in its very methodology, is intrinsically violent.
This requires careful unpacking. How does one argue that the law of thermodynamics or the germ theory of disease contains inherent violence?
Well, the alternative science movement argued that the scientific method's core demands its insistence on objectivity, its separation of fact from subjective value, and its search for universal, verifiable laws was not a discovery of universal truth, but rather an epoch-specific ethnic Western project.
Wow.
Yeah. They viewed the assertion of universal scientific laws as a psychological weapon deployed to delegitimize and destroy alternative, indigenous, holistic ways of knowing the natural world. Science was framed as a colonial monologue that silenced all other cultural dialogues.
So they are asserting a radical scientific relativism here. They are claiming there is no overarching universal scientific reality. There's only local cultural knowledge pretending to be universal in order to establish dominance.
And this assertion leads Nanda to draw a chilling, undeniable historical parallel. This exact brand of epistemological relativism, the insistence that science is merely an expression of local culture and cannot be judged by universal objective standards, was the central thesis of Oswald Spengler in The Decline of the West.
Wait, the Weimar reactionary modernist?
The very same. Spengler explicitly argued that there was no such thing as international science, only science that reflected the soul of a specific culture. And the National Socialist movement in Germany eagerly weaponized this exact relativistic logic.
Right, because if truth is not universal, it is merely an expression of identity.
Exactly. They utilized this epistemological framework to promote Aryan physics, elevating intuition and racial spirit over empirical data, and to explicitly ban the theoretical physics of Albert Einstein, dismissing the theory of relativity as detached, soulless Jewish science.
That is deeply unsettling, because Nanda is demonstrating that the underlying mechanics of civilizational epistemology, the idea that the validity of a truth claim depends entirely on the cultural or racial identity of the person making it, does not miraculously become benign simply because it is deployed by left-wing scholars with anti-imperialist intentions.
No, the logic itself is inherently corrosive.
Mm-hmm.
If you eliminate the concept of a universal objective standard of truth, you reduce all intellectual discourse to a pure power struggle. Truth is simply whatever the most dominant group in society says it is.
And as history progressed in India, the most dominant group was not going to be the post-colonial academics.
No, it wasn't. And this vulnerability is further exposed when we examine the concept of strategic essentialism.
Yes. Strategic essentialism. This was famously introduced by the foundational post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak.
Right. So, in the humanities, reducing a diverse, complex population to a single static stereotype or essence is generally viewed as an analytical failure and a tool of oppression. But Spivak argued that for marginalized groups attempting to build political solidarity, it could be tactically necessary to temporarily embrace these essentialist categories.
Let me clarify this concept with an analogy. It's like playing a wild card in a game, right?
How do you mean?
Well, the logic suggests that while you know intellectually that your community is vastly diverse and cannot be defined by a single cultural trait, you temporarily adopt a unified, simplified cultural identity to present a united front against a dominant power. You utilize the stereotype as a defensive shield and a rallying cry, while simultaneously maintaining the right to condemn the dominant culture whenever they attempt to force an essentialist label onto you.
It is an attempt to utilize the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, as the saying goes. But Nanda's critique of this approach is devastatingly simple and entirely pragmatic. She observes that what is good for the goose is good for the gander.
Because you cannot introduce a rhetorical weapon into the political arena and expect your political opponents to just refrain from picking it up.
Exactly. The Hindu right observed this post-colonial framework, the legitimization of strategic essentialism, and the attack on universal secularism, and recognized it as the perfect intellectual vehicle for their own agenda.
Right. They just adopted the exact same logic.
They did. They used the logic of provincializing Europe and protecting indigenous epistemology, but they deployed it to aggressively shield Vedic metaphysics, traditional social hierarchies, and majoritarian supremacy from any secular or constitutional critique. The left essentially designed the precise blueprint that the right used to build their political fortress.
Which brings us to the philosophical epicenter of Nanda's critique, and frankly, the concept that ultimately dictates whether a democratic society can protect its most vulnerable citizens. We have to dive into the academic disagreement surrounding disenchantment.
Yes, this is the critical juncture of the text. To understand Nanda's defense of modernity, we must grapple with the sociologist Max Weber's concept of Entzaubberung, which is universally translated as disenchantment.
Okay, break that down for us.
For Weber, disenchantment was the defining, irreversible process of entering the modern age. It is the progressive historical evacuation of magic, spirits, and divine moral purpose from the mechanics of the natural world.
Okay, to visualize this shift, consider the historical understanding of agriculture. In an enchanted worldview, a drought is not a meteorological event. It is a moral judgment.
Right. It's the result of divine displeasure.
Exactly, requiring appeasement through ritual, sacrifice, or adherence to strict social taboos. But disenchantment occurs when a society collectively accepts that the natural world operates on blind, physical laws, atmospheric pressure, evaporation, condensation.
Yes, the universe ceases to be a magical realm of divine whims and becomes a legible mechanism.
Like realizing meteorology causes rain, not a rain god. You stop trying to appease the sky and start building an umbrella.
That's it, exactly. Disenchantment separates the physical facts of the universe from human moral values. However, there is a profound academic schism regarding whether this process is universally necessary.
This is where Charles Taylor comes in, right?
Yes, the philosopher Charles Taylor is the most prominent voice arguing against the universality of Weber's model. Taylor posits that the specific trajectory of secularization and complete disenchantment that occurred in the West was a highly localized historical anomaly, driven specifically by the theological shifts of the Protestant Reformation.
Which provides massive intellectual cover for the post-colonial left, because he suggests that we should not expect, let alone force, non-Western societies to undergo this exact same process of secularization in order to achieve modernity.
Right. He advocates for the possibility of alternative modernities where non-Western societies can embrace modern technology and administration while retaining their enchanted, spiritually infused cultural frameworks.
And the postcolonial scholars eagerly adopt Taylor's premise because it validates their core argument. India does not need Western secularism to thrive. It can forge a uniquely Indian modernity rooted in traditional spirituality.
But Nanda vehemently and aggressively rejects Taylor's framework. She sides completely with Weber. She argues that for India, disenchantment is not a Western luxury. It is an absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for basic human rights.
And her unyielding stance on this is rooted in the specific mechanics of traditional Indian theology. Why does India need disenchantment? Why is the retention of an enchanted worldview so uniquely dangerous in the Indian context?
Because Nanda meticulously details how Vedantic theology bears a very specific social burden. It is a fundamentally monistic system, meaning it views all of reality from the divine to the material as a single, interconnected whole.
Right.
But the critical issue is that this theology naturalizes the supernatural. It takes rigid human social hierarchies, specifically the caste system, varna, and the concept of karma, and projects them onto the immutable structure of the cosmos itself.
Wow. So in this traditional enchanted framework, caste is not understood as a sociological construct. It is not viewed as an economic class system built on the unequal distribution of resources or political power, which can be, reformed or dismantled through legislation.
No, not at all. Within traditional Vedic classification schemes, caste is a fundamental law of physics. The hierarchy codes everything in the universe. Different gods have castes. The cardinal directions on a compass have castes. Different species of flora and fauna are categorized by caste purity.
The social order is literally written into the atomic structure of the universe.
Yes. And this reveals the profound, heartbreaking flaw in the post-colonial left's reliance on Charles Taylor. Because if you exempt India from disenchantment, as Taylor suggests, if you protect this enchanted worldview in the name of preserving authentic culture, you are simultaneously protecting a cosmic caste system from ever facing rational democratic scrutiny.
If society tells you that your poverty is the result of an unfair economic policy, you can organize a labor union and protest. But if traditional theology dictates that your status as an outcast is the direct cosmic result of your actions in past lives, a fundamental law of the universe, how do you protest gravity? You cannot pass a civil rights amendment against the cosmos.
You really can't. And this is Nanda's most vital contribution to the discourse. She completely inverts the post-colonial anxiety regarding epistemic violence. The left-wing academics spent decades agonizing over the conceptual violence that modern objective science supposedly inflicts upon indigenous knowledge systems.
Right.
Nanda demands that we look at the actual physical daily violence that indigenous knowledge systems inflict upon the people trapped at the absolute bottom of its hierarchy.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening, and frankly, heartbreaking. Because for the Dalits, for women, for the historically marginalized, an enchanted cosmos is not a reservoir of beautiful, diverse spiritual meaning. It is a suffocating, inescapable mechanism of oppression.
Right. By romanticizing traditional religious consciousness as a form of anti-colonial resistance, the elite academic left effectively abandons the actual living subaltern populations to the tyranny of traditional hierarchies.
So, to actively combat this cultural relativism, Nanda builds her defense of universal objective truth on two major theoretical pillars. The first is a philosopher Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach. Let's talk about that.
Sure. Nussbaum's framework is a powerful alternative to both Western utilitarianism and post-colonial relativism. Rather than judging a society by its overall economic output, or conversely declaring all cultural practices equally valid, the capabilities approach asks a very grounded universal question. What is each individual person actually capable of doing and being?
It doesn't just ask if a constitution guarantees freedom of speech on paper. It asks if a Dalit woman in a rural village has the actual material capability to seek education, to participate in politics, to walk through her village without fear of violence.
Precisely. Nussbaum argues that the baseline requirements for human flourishing and dignity are universal, not Western. The specific cultural expressions of a good life will naturally vary between New Delhi and New York, but the fundamental standard of bodily integrity and mental development belongs to the human species.
That makes total sense. And Nanda's second pillar reinforces this biological universality. She relies heavily on the linguist and philosopher Noam Chomsky's concept of the science-forming faculty.
Yes, Chomsky posits that the human capacity for abductive reasoning, the ability to formulate hypotheses, test them against reality, and deduce natural laws is not a cultural invention of the European Enlightenment. It is an innate biological trait of the human brain, evolved over millennia.
Therefore, the scientific method is a human inheritance, not a Western import. Nanda points out the deeply insulting irony of the postcolonial position here.
It really is insulting.
To declare that scientific rationality is an act of epistemic violence against non-Western peoples is to inherently imply that non-Western populations do not possess the same biological capacity for rational, empirical thought as Europeans.
It is a form of academic condescension masquerading as solidarity. Nanda forcefully argues that the true champions of the marginalized in Indian history were never the post-colonial theorists writing from elite global universities.
No. The actual heroes were the secularists, the rationalists, and figures like B.R. Ambedkar, the principal architect of the Indian Constitution.
Exactly. Ambedkar, a Dalit himself, did not romanticize traditional indigenous knowledge. He correctly identified it as the source of caste oppression, and he wielded the Enlightenment tools of universal human rights, legal equality, and secularism as weapons to dismantle that oppression. He treated his people as human beings entitled to modern rights, not as fragile museum exhibits of pre-modern authenticity.
Which brings us to the grand, tragic pivot of the historical narrative. If the post-colonial left spent decades systematically attacking objective science, dismantling the moral authority of secularism, and romanticizing indigenous religious frameworks, believing they were protecting the subaltern who actually picked up the pieces.
Nanda argues it was the Hindu right. In removing the intellectual guardrails of universal truth, the left created an immense ideological vacuum.
And when you tear down the walls of a city, you don't just liberate the citizens, you clear the path for a highly organized invading army.
And this brings us to their embrace of what political scientists term palingenetic ultranationalism.
Okay, let's define that. Palingenetic ultranationalism. We have to utilize the framework developed by the political theorist Roger Griffin here.
Right. Griffin identified palingenetic ultranationalism as the core mobilizing myth of fascism and extreme right-wing movements. Palingenesis translates literally to rebirth. It is the intoxicating revolutionary myth that the nation is a living organism that has been corrupted and degraded by foreign influences and modern decadence, and it must rise from the ashes to reclaim its ancient mythological purity and glory.
This distinguishes them from traditional conservatives, right? Because a traditional conservative generally wants to maintain the current status quo, perhaps slowing the rate of social change. A palingenetic movement is revolutionary. They view the current system as irredeemably corrupt, and they wish to burn it down to resurrect a glorious, idealized past.
Yes, and Nanda meticulously demonstrates that this palingenetic framework was the animating force of mainstream Indian nationalism long before the creation of modern political parties like the BJP. The intellectual foundation was poured in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by towering, globally recognized figures, pioneers like Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo.
Now, this requires a significant reevaluation of historical icons, because Swami Vivekananda is globally celebrated, largely due to his famous address at the 1893 World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago, where he introduced Hinduism to a Western audience.
True.
He is traditionally codified in history books as this avatar of universal tolerance, interfaith harmony, and spiritual universalism.
But Nanda bypasses the popular hagiography and conducts a rigorous textual analysis of his actual writings and lectures directed at Indian audiences. She reveals a much darker exclusionary foundation. Vivekananda heavily absorbed and deployed the Aryan racial theories popularized by the German philologist Max Miller.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Vivekananda did not merely argue that India possessed valuable spiritual insights. He argued that the Indian upper castes were the true Aryans, possessing a superior spiritual biology, while the Europeans were fallen Aryans trapped in coarse materialism.
So the rhetoric of spiritual universalism was fundamentally underpinned by a framework of racial and civilizational supremacy.
Furthermore, Vivekananda vehemently defended the traditional caste system. He did not view it as a social ill to be reformed, but as a natural cosmic institution necessary for spiritual order. When he engaged with the West, he did so with a presumption of innate superiority. His goal was to barter Indian spiritual supremacy for Western material science and technology, strictly on his own terms, to empower the Hindu nation.
And then we have Sri Aurobindo, writing slightly later, who accelerated this palingenetic vision even further. Aurobindo's nationalism was deeply organicist. He did not view the Indian nation as a modern republic bound together by a legal constitution and shared citizenship. He viewed India, Mother India, as a literal, biological, sacred entity.
Right. Aurobindo explicitly instructed his followers to plunder Western science, technology, and organizational methods, but strictly to serve the ultimate glory of Hindu supremacy. He recognized the necessity of modern hardware, but insisted the software must be exclusively Vedic.
And then to point out a critical mechanism here, subversion. These early nationalists did not want to imitate the liberal West. They wanted to subvert modern vocabulary to serve ancient goals.
Yes. They engaged in a massive project of semantic hijacking. They took the prestigious vocabulary of the Enlightenment, words like science, freedom, and democracy, and systematically emptied them of their liberal definitions.
They then refilled those exact words with Vedantic theological concepts. In their literature, science no longer meant empirical observation. It meant the intuitive yogic perception of the ancient rishis. Democracy no longer meant the political equality of the individual. It meant the harmonious maintenance of traditional caste hierarchies without conflict.
And freedom was stripped of its political meaning, liberty from state oppression, and redefined as the spiritual liberation achieved by fulfilling your preordained cosmic duty within the Varna system.
They stole the legitimacy of modern terminology to insulate ancient hierarchical power structures from criticism. And Nanda demonstrates that the contemporary vanguard of the Hindu right is utilizing this exact semantic playbook today, but they have upgraded their weaponry by fully integrating the academic jargon generated by the postcolonial left.
It's incredible to watch. Let's examine how this synthesis operates in practice by looking at 4 key contemporary figures who form the intellectual vanguard of the modern right.
Let's do it.
We begin with the Belgian scholar Konrad Elst. His prominent work, Decolonizing the Hindu Mind, is a masterclass in co-opting left-wing methodology. He entirely adopts the psychological framework established by left-wing theorists like Ashish Mandi.
So Elst argues that the primary struggle for India is throwing off the shackles of mental colonization to recover its authentic indigenous identity. But if he's using the exact same framework as the left, what is the ideological pivot that transforms his work into a tool for right-wing majoritarianism?
The pivot is a simple manipulation of the historical timeline. While the post-colonial left focused almost exclusively on the psychological damage inflicted by British colonialism, Elst expands the definition of colonizer backward in time.
How far back?
He argues that the true colonization of the Hindu mind began in the 8th century with the arrival of Islam, starting with Muhammad bin Qasim.
Oh, by extending the timeline, the post-colonial left-wing demand to purge society of colonial influence is instantly weaponized into a political demand to purge Indian society of Islamic cultural, architectural, and demographic influence.
Exactly. It is an incredibly effective rhetorical maneuver. The language of anti-imperialist decolonization is seamlessly translated into a justification for targeting a domestic minority. It highlights the inherent danger of defining politics purely around authenticity rather than universal rights.
Who is the next figure in this vanguard?
We must look at S.N. Balagangadhara. He takes the foundational text of post-colonial studies, Edward Said's Orientalism, and pushes its logic to an absolute extreme. Said argued that Western academia systematically mischaracterized and stereotyped the East to justify imperial rule. Balagangadhara goes much further. He argues that Western scholars did not merely misrepresent Indian culture, they literally invented it.
Wait, he argues that the foundational structures of Indian society are historical hallucinations projected onto the subcontinent by European administrators.
Essentially, yes. His most audacious claim is that the caste system as a rigid, oppressive hierarchy is entirely a European colonial invention, a conceptual framework forced onto a society that organically lacked such rigid divisions.
The real-world consequence of this argument is staggering. If you convince a population that the caste system is nothing more than a Western colonial fiction, you completely insulate the traditional social hierarchy from any form of internal or external critique.
Right, because any critique is just a Western hallucination.
Any modern Dalit activist demanding civil rights, any sociologist pointing out systemic discrimination can be immediately dismissed as someone suffering from a colonized mind, parroting Western lies. It uses the prestige of anti-colonial academia to construct an impenetrable shield around domestic oppression.
That is the precise utility of the argument. And moving to the realm of popular pseudoscience, we find Rajiv Malhotra. Malhotra explicitly utilizes Gayatri Spivak's concept of strategic essentialism to assert the superiority of Indian inner sciences.
Okay, inner sciences.
Yeah, he argues that ancient yogic and meditative practices are not just culturally valuable, but are empirically equivalent or superior to Western quantum physics and cognitive biology. Nanda, leaning on her background in biotechnology, meticulously disassembles these claims, demonstrating how Malhotra dresses up theological assertions in the complex, impenetrable jargon of postcolonial theory to bypass scientific peer review.
But the culmination of this intellectual trajectory, the point where postcolonial theory and paleogenetic nationalism fully merge, is found in the work of J. Sai Deepak, right?
Yes. His 2021 bestseller, India, that is Harat, represents the apex of this ideological crossover. Sai Deepak explicitly imports Latin American decolonial theory, specifically the frameworks developed by scholars like Walter Mignolo, to construct a radical structural argument about the Indian state.
He is using cutting-edge academic theory from the global south to argue for what exactly?
He argues that the entire Indian constitution, as currently written, is an illegitimate colonial document. He claims it is built entirely on Western Christian epistemology and Enlightenment individualism. Using the language of decoloniality, he proposes that the constitution must be fundamentally rewritten, replacing liberal democratic principles with Vedic philosophy.
And the implications for citizenship in this proposed framework?
They are drastic. He suggests that true citizenship in this decolonized nation, Bharat, should not be a birthright guarantee to all residents. It should be contingent upon possessing a Vedic orientation of consciousness.
Wow. If citizenship is tied to a specific theological orientation, then secular rationalists, Christians, and Muslims are immediately reclassified. They are no longer equal citizens. They are ideologically foreign entities.
Yes, they become a permanent, formalized outgroup in their own country.
The concept of individual universal rights is entirely replaced by the collective rights of a dominant religiously defined community. It is the exclusionary vision of the early 20th century ethno-nationalists, resurrected and legitimized by the modern academic language of decolonization.
It really forces a brutal reckoning for the academic left. How did an intellectual movement driven by a genuine desire for social justice end up manufacturing the precise rhetorical tools now being used to dismantle secular democracy?
So what does this all mean for India today? Why didn't the post-colonial left see this coming? Nanda addresses this failure by invoking a brilliant, highly critical concept from the Hungarian Marxist philosopher György Lukács, the Grand Hotel Abyss.
Right. Lukács coined this term to describe a very specific pathology that infects elite intellectual circles when they become detached from the material realities of the working class.
The visualization of this concept is incredibly stark. Imagine a group of highly educated, affluent intellectuals. They are seated on the expansive terrace of a luxurious five-star resort. They are drinking fine wine, analyzing complex texts, and writing beautifully constructed, morally indignant essays.
Right, they're living well.
But this magnificent resort is built directly on the edge of a terrifying, bottomless cliff. And while these intellectuals debate the abstract, aesthetic, and epistemological meaning of the cliff, they completely ignore the actual marginalized people who were literally falling over the edge right in front of them.
It perfectly encapsulates Nanda's devastating critique of the post-colonial left. She argues that as these academics move into tenured positions at elite global universities, they retain their performance of moral indignation, but they fundamentally abandon the hard, unglamorous fight for socioeconomic justice.
They traded the difficult material struggle against poverty, lack of sanitation, and class inequality for exclusively culturalist politics.
Exactly. They stopped organizing labor movements to demand higher wages, and instead began organizing academic conferences to demand epistemological decolonization. They replaced the fight for material equality with the fight for cultural authenticity.
And the political tragedy, as Nanda points out, is that a political movement obsessed solely with cultural authenticity provides absolutely zero defense against the ruthless material realities of modern state power. The Hindu right is not hindered by academic critiques of their epistemology. They are focused on winning parliamentary majorities, appointing judges, and rewriting legislation.
And we can observe the tangible, real-world policy outcomes of this intellectual shift in India today. Nanda observes that the ruling BJP under Narendra Modi has successfully executed a dual strategy. They have embraced ruthless, modern neoliberal economics on one hand, while simultaneously asserting a narrative of Hindu civilizational supremacy on the other.
They have constructed a highly effective national narrative where the Hindu majority represents the authentic, ancient wisdom of the civilization, while secularists, liberals, and religious minorities are cast as the mentally colonized internal enemies working to dilute the nation's purity.
And Nanda notes with clinical precision that it was the post-colonial left who first legitimized the tactic of dismissing secularists and rationalists as mentally colonized. The right simply adopted the label and applied it to a much broader demographic.
And this ideology is actively being codified into state policy. Nanda points specifically to the National Education Policy, the NEP, implemented in 2020.
Yes, the NEP 2020 mandates the integration of Indian knowledge systems into the national curriculum, fundamentally altering the educational priorities. It actively diminishes the historical constitutional mandate to cultivate a scientific temper among the citizenry.
This means they're institutionalizing the exact relativist arguments pioneered by the alternative science movement decades ago. They are shifting the educational framework to suggest that Western empirical science is merely one way of knowing, and that traditional, text-based Vedic knowledge systems carry equal epistemological weight in a classroom setting.
It is the ultimate institutional realization of what the left argued for decades. The left demanded that indigenous knowledge be elevated to the same status as empirical science. The right, utilizing state power, is now making that demand a legal reality, prioritizing cultural identity over objective scientific education.
We have covered an immense amount of historical and philosophical ground today. Let's synthesize the core insights of this deep dive.
We have traced the trajectory of a highly complex academic framework, postcolonialism. A theory genuinely constructed to emancipate marginalized populations from the psychological scars of imperialism ultimately provided the intellectual scaffolding for a conservative, exclusionary nationalist revival.
Right. We observed the historical structural parallels, looking back at the Weimar Republic, to see how reactionary modernists embraced the hardware of industrialization while violently rejecting the Enlightenment software of human rights and objective truth. We saw that exact volatile dynamic mirrored in India's response to colonial trauma and uneven modernization.
We analyzed how intellectuals like Ashish Nandi and the alternative science movement attacked modern empirical science as an act of epistemic violence, inadvertently replicating the dangerous, localized truth models championed by early 20th century figures like Oswald Spengler.
We navigated the profound debate surrounding Max Weber's concept of disenchantment, confronting the uncomfortable reality that if a society refuses to disenchant its natural world, it risks permanently trapping its most vulnerable citizens within a cosmic hierarchy that justifies their daily oppression.
And finally, we witnessed the mechanics of ideological co-optation. We saw how the Hindu right, from early organicist pioneers like Aurobindo to modern strategists like Sai Deepak, seamlessly appropriated the left-wing vocabulary of decolonization to advance a palingenetic vision. A reborn, pure nation that legally and culturally marginalizes anyone outside its theological boundaries.
The essential question remains for you, the listener. Why does this specific intellectual history matter to you? Why should you care about the nuances of Indian political theory? Well, because this narrative serves as a stark empirical warning about the fragile nature of democratic institutions globally.
Absolutely.
It demonstrates that when intellectual movements decide to dismantle the concepts of universal objective truth and universal human rights, even if they do so to critique historical injustices, they do not create a pluralistic utopia. They create a massive structural power vacuum.
And history guarantees that the most organized, aggressive ethno-nationalist forces will inevitably rush in to fill that vacuum, using the very tools of deconstruction to build new walls.
That realization brings us to a final, highly concerning global trend that Nanda touches upon, which extends far beyond the borders of India. Nanda observes that traditional postcolonial theory, the literary, nuanced critique associated with figures like Edward Said, is actually fading. It's losing its dominance in global academia in the West.
Right.
What framework is replacing it on university campuses?
It is being rapidly superseded by decolonial theory, spearheaded by scholars like Walter Mignolo and Annibal Quijano. This newer framework abandons the ambivalence of postcolonialism and embraces a much harder, unyielding, anti-Western civilizational stance.
It seeks an absolute rupture with Western epistemology.
Exactly. And the truly alarming development is where this theory is finding its most enthusiastic political reception.
Right, because it isn't just taking root in academic seminars anymore. It is being actively embraced by authoritarian state apparatuses in places like Russia, China, and Iran.
Yes. These regimes are increasingly adopting the academic language of decoloniality. They utilize it to justify their crackdowns on internal dissent, framing any domestic demand for universal human rights, freedom of the press, or democratic elections as simply another insidious form of Western colonization that must be repelled to protect civilizational sovereignty.
Which leaves us with a profound, provocative thought for you to mull over on your own as we conclude today's deep dive. If the well-intentioned postcolonial theories of the late 20th century accidentally provided the rhetorical ammunition for a nationalist crisis in India by eroding objective truth, how might the much more aggressive decolonial frameworks currently dominating elite global universities be quietly laying the intellectual groundwork for entirely new, sophisticated authoritarian movements worldwide right now? We may very well be watching the Weimar dynamic replicate itself on a global scale, hidden behind the language of liberation.
The historical record suggests that ideas, once released from the confines of the Grand Hotel abyss, possess a momentum entirely independent of their creators' intentions.
They inevitably do. Which returns us to the imagery we began with. When analyzing history, when attempting to understand how abstract theory reshapes the physical reality of millions, the diagnostic X-ray machine is not actually broken. The machine functions perfectly. We just have to possess the intellectual courage to look at the murky, complex, and often deeply contradictory images it produces. We must be willing to identify the fractures exactly where they exist, especially when those fractures appear within the very ideologies we desperately hoped would heal us. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.